You know, Stephen Sondheim used to say that writers for the musical theater, himself included, have trouble once they reach the age of 50. Reason being that tastes in popular culture change about every 20 years, if not sooner. And in our time, much sooner. Yes? So Sondheim said that older writers get out of touch and often find it difficult to adjust. Mary Rogers, for example, reported that it was obvious her father became worried that he was quote unquote drying up after The King and I. And there's some evidence that he was. As for Flower Drum Song, Rogers was 56 and Oscar Hammerstein 63 when it was produced on Broadway in 1958. It was a success that received a national tour, a long-running London production, a splendid original cast album, and a popular and loyal film version produced by Ross Hunter in 1961, a year after Hammerstein's death, with Miyoshi Umeki and Juanita Hall reprising their Broadway roles. I'm going to talk mostly about the Broadway original in this little visit. My co-host in a week, Arnold Hirschon, likes the movie a lot, and he's going to do more with it than I will. But I think we need to know about the roots of Flower Drum Song. And for the record, as every politician now says, let me be clear. I like Flower Drum Song too. It's just that I think Sondheim had a good point. And for me, there's some bloom off the peach in this musical. Hammerstein called it his quote-unquote lucky hit, and one wonders what he meant by that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Flower Drum Song was very much of its time, and after the film, it virtually disappeared until its only Broadway revival in 2002. More about that later as well. The musical was based on a best-selling novel by Chinese-American C.Y. Lee. It deals with the conflict between traditionalist older Chinese Americans, embodied by patriarch Wang Qiyang, and their Americanized children who are anxious to break away. Mei Li, played by the Japanese actress Miyoshi Umeki, is a lovely picture bride from Hong Kong who has arrived with her father to fulfill her contract to marry Sammy Fong, a local nightclub owner. But Sammy prefers Linda Lowe, who in the show's hit song obviously enjoys being a girl. The problem is resolved when Wang Ta, son of the patriarch, falls in love with Mei Li. This piece was really a natural for Rodgers and Hammerstein. The idea of how generations differ in their views on assimilation. That's really solid story content. But for only the second time in his collaboration with Richard Rodgers, Hammerstein worked with a co-librettist, the playwright Joseph Fields, who brought the idea to them in the first place. What the three men created was seldom less than professional. It just wasn't always inspired. This response to director Gene Kelly's production, his only musical as a Broadway director, by the way, this response was typical. Brooks Atkinson in the New York Times found it a pleasant interlude. To the collaborators' credit, though, it should be said that as good liberals, Hammerstein and Fields offered some pungent social commentary. Wang Qiyang observes, "All white men look alike." A twist on the sort of racial stereotyping that we learned to condemn in the 1960s. And one of the virtues of the piece is that, as usual, Rodgers and Hammerstein are finding universals. The song Chop Suey springs from the Chinese Americans' attempt to make sense of a post-war media explosion that has only become louder and more frantic in the ensuing decades. Hammerstein's helter-skelter hodgepodge is now irrelevant. Ballpoint pens and filter tips, lipstick and potato chips. Dreaming in my maiden-form bra, dreamed I danced the cha-cha-cha. But all Americans would have related to the idea then. And can't we easily imagine replacing the lyrics now with images from our own time? Other songs are truly distinguished, such as 100 Million Miracles, the song that is really the musical's credo. The soaring Love Look Away, the reflective You Are Beautiful, and especially for me, Méliès' exquisite I Am Going to Like It Here, in which Hammerstein is still experimenting. He borrows from an ancient poetic technique called pantoum, in which entire lines are repeated. No bloom off the peach in these moments, all of which are captured in the movie version. Speaking of Umeki, where Flower Drum Song utterly charms is in its depiction of her 18-year-old picture bride. I believe Méliès is an entirely new kind of character on our musical stage, and that we've never seen the likes of her since. Described as shy by Stanley Greene, she actually goes much deeper than that. Méliès is quiet and serene, which imbues her scenes with an aura we seldom encounter in an art form that's mostly about high energy. As played by the delicate, luminous Umeki, this young woman is today what we would call centered. I want to say something about the 2002 Broadway revival. Our trustee Ted Chapin, who headed the Rodgers and Hammerstein organization for 40 years, tells the story of how the contemporary playwright David Henry Hwang approached him about rewriting and updating the script. As a teenager, Hwang liked seeing the movie on TV because it was the first Hollywood movie starring a virtually all Asian cast and in a contemporary setting to boot. But for him, the ethnic stereotypes and sexism, for instance, in I Enjoy Being a Girl, all of that made the film what he called a guilty pleasure. Ted Chapin gave his permission, and though I didn't get to see what was really a revisal on Broadway, Flower Drum Song was no longer patronizing. It was a rethinking that's been called careful and effective. But now let's return to that opening observation from Stephen Sondheim about writers who are older than 50. Maybe the reason Oscar Hammerstein called Flower Drum Song his lucky hit was that he knew that he and Rodgers and Fields were too old and too white to tell this story. They weren't capable of being fully in sync with such a culturally specific piece. They had no first-hand knowledge of it. Unsurprisingly, Rodgers and Hammerstein's writing for the kids is unhip. What language are you speaking? Asks Father Wang Chi-yang, to which his younger son replies, That's bop, pop. No comment. And then there's Linda Lowe's impromptu demonstration of rock and roll. You be the rock, I'll be the roll. You be the soup, I'll be the bowl. That's not satire, it's just bad writing. I find it startling to contemplate that this musical and West Side Story were running simultaneously on Broadway. And yet, we also find great sensitivity and love in this musical. We're going to close with some words from Oscar Hammerstein, and you will hear him speak just 6 months before his death. As the 1950s moved forward, Hammerstein could see something happening in our country, and he didn't like it. He could sense a way of looking at the world that was sharply different from his own. As a result, he was being criticized more and more often, but he steadfastly clung to his beliefs. After Flower Drum Song, we had the privilege of learning about life from him just one more time in The Sound of Music.
I think that today perhaps we lack this positive approach, that there are a great many songs and articles and novels, stories coming out of America that are on the sick side and neglect the great health and hope which has always been our real characteristics and the characteristics that have made us a great country. If we neglect these, we will soon slide back into being far inferior to what we have been. In other words, the world is quite a wonderful place. It's not perfect, but as I say in the Flower Drum Song, 100 million miracles are happening every day. And those who say they don't agree are those who do not hear or see. 100 million miracles are happening every day.
Indeed. I'm Bill Rudman from the Musical Theater Project.